Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependent podcast. Today, I'm with Sipan Nazaryan. Sipan graduated from Pepperdine this summer with a master's in clinical psychology. He worked under Kent Toussaint at Child and Teen Counseling for his traineeship, and now he's working under Anita Avidian at Anger Management 818/Avidian Counseling Center for his associateship. Sipan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Marissa. Happy to be here.
Yes. All right. So first question, I'm curious, how do you conceptualize codependency?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in kind of my specialty. Of course, I've worked with, clients as young as 8 and as old as 63, but it seems like my bread and butter has become teenage boys, teens and adolescents and their families, working with their families as well. And in their situation, I'd say that codependency really looks like kind of I'd kind of define it in two ways. I'd say maybe it's sort of like an addiction to a specific relationship. But
Mm,
additionally, it's sort of when someone loses the ability to see where they end and maybe somebody else begins,
right.
right? So those boundaries really between people kind of start to dissolve. I'd say that's how I kind of see it in my client base.
Mhm. Can you say more about, because I want to hear more about the second part, but more about the addiction to a specific relationship. What does it look like to be addicted to a specific relationship?
Yeah, it's I've oftentimes seen clients that have a really hard time, you know, it's as if they see themselves through the eyes of another person, whether it's a best
Mm,
friend or a significant other, maybe even I've seen examples of siblings too.
right.
Um, and it's, the comparisons can be very unhealthy, and it's interesting when you see somebody with codependency issues is their perspective is very skewed, so they may not necessarily see it, and they might even kind of in their own minds reconstruct the relationship to look like it's healthy. I spend a lot of time with this person. We really get along. Two peas in a pod. There's also in popular culture, there's a lot of like terms that people kind of throw around in situations like this. So they'll say, "This is my twin flame," or they'll say, "This is my soulmate." And I've seen, again in my clinical practice, I've seen people say that this is the only person that I could be in a romantic relationship with. If it wasn't
Right.
for this person, I would just be single forever. Or I've
Right.
even heard recently from a client that this is the only person that I could have kids with. So I might be able to have romantic relationships with other people, but this is the only person that I'm willing to have kids with. So,
Mhm.
these are little things that you have to very delicately, because it is obviously it's very personal, and they hold these people very near and dear to their hearts. So you don't want to signal their defense mechanisms. So you don't want to lose them, as a client immediately. You don't want to lose them in the process, but it is something to very, very gently kind of poke and prod at. Like, where are we going with this? Why does this
Right.
kind of, and then that leads into some discussions about codependency, and then later on we kind of talk about attachment types and stuff like that.
Mhm. Okay. And any other thoughts on, yeah, not being able to distinguish where like the codependent ends and someone else begins? What might that look like?
Well, that'll look like pretty much, I mean, you have to keep in mind with the clients I work for, because, a lot of my clients are 16, 17, 18-year-old teenage boys. There are a lot of really big decisions that get made around that time. Licenses, cars, prom, going off to college. And it seems like from somebody who is codependent, from their perspective, when they're in, obviously when they're making these decisions, they run it by their therapist. So I get kind of like a firsthand view. But
Mm,
the key deciding factor is taking into account what that other person's perspective, or what they may think that other person's perspective may be. So
right,
it's like constantly, and it seems like every big and small decision that they're making, you have this other person's perspective being taken into account. And it's, of course, like even as adults, as therapists, as people who I like to think we're pretty healthy when it comes to codependencies that are, at a reasonable rate. Yeah, hopefully at a reasonable rate. But it's we obviously take other people's perspectives on us into account when we make big decisions.
right,
I think that's totally normal. It's important to
right.
normalize that with our clients. What I
Yes,
find is that, in my clients, in teens and adolescents, it's proportionally, it's just a bit, I'd say it's a bit unhealthy, and it's a bit unbalanced, is what I
right.
would say.
Yeah, I'm picturing like a scale, and it's other people's opinions, my opinion. And yeah, particularly during adolescence, hopefully it changes over time. But yeah, the weight of that scale is like very imbalanced. Yeah, especially too if yeah, you're like slowly unconsciously cultivating codependent relationships. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So you're already starting to hint at it. But yeah, preparing for this interview, Sipan, I talked with you. So just everyone. Yeah, I wrote teen boys aren't the first demographic that come to mind when I think codependent. It's not, I think if we Google codependent, we're not going to see a bunch of 16, 17, 18-year-old images of teen
Hmm.
boys. And you've already started to share, but I'm curious to hear other additional codependent traits and characteristics you've observed in this population.
Well, let's go ahead and take it back a step. I would say that teen boys, and not just boys, I'd say just teenagers in general, are very susceptible to codependency. Obviously, when you
Mm-hmm.
think of codependency, that's not the first thing that comes to mind, of course. But
Right,
I think just because of the that time in your life, around 12, 13, 14 is when people begin to individuate. They begin to kind of try to begin the steps of becoming their own person, separating from their not parents entirely, but to a certain extent,
right,
and kind of that momentum of individuation coupled by maybe a lack of connection with their parents, because that might be a time when you really have a difficult time. I've said time a million times, but you really do have a difficult time connecting with your parents, and then you go into high school and you begin to really connect with friends, and maybe hopefully a trusted adult at school like a coach or a teacher or an assistant principal or something. But
yeah,
that momentum really makes you susceptible to codependency. But besides that, I'd say there's two other things. I'd say that, boundary setting most definitely is skills based. And there's a lot of 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds that don't have that skill developed yet. So
right,
you have this momentum of, okay, around this age, I begin to individuate from my parental unit. So I'm becoming my own person. And you do need to connect to somebody. So as the connection begins to diminish with your parents, there's that void, there's that need for connection, which
mm,
which is kind of a hotbed for codependency. And then there's also the lack of boundary setting as a skill. So
right,
again, it's you're very, I'd say it's a hotbed of codependency issues. And then additionally, and this is something that I wanted to touch on later, but I feel like it kind of ties in now, to kind of step into my sociology 101 from my undergrad. We learned about something called group embeddedness, which
mm,
essentially means, let's say, for example, you have four individuals, right? Um, so four nodes, like the minimum amount of connections that you could have between four for individuals is three connections, right? The
Right.
maximum would be six. So not only are all four connected on the edges, but then there's like the two, you know what I mean? I guess you could kind of see it visually speaking. So the more connections you have between people, the more there's group embeddedness. And I would say that oftentimes, especially in high school, a lot of these groups they are very high in group embeddedness, which
Mm-hmm.
means, well, let's take a look at the opposite end. Let's say it was sort of like a spoken wheel, or like you were sort of like an individual in like a web in the middle. Um, I think it's definitely a skill, or maybe it's something to look out for somebody to have compartmentalization in their groups. And that's definitely something that, the average 15, 16-year-old fails to kind of grasp. And when
Right.
you have that compartmentalization, one of the things it allows for is not only can you, I feel like, better enact boundary setting, but I think more of your relationships are modular. So if
Mm-hmm.
this person really ends up being, for the lack of a better term, a bad apple, you could easily kind of disconnect, right? So you
Right.
could already visually start to see the modular nature of your relationships. But if you have high group embeddedness, you can't really take a node and disconnect it because everybody's sort of hyper connected with each other.
Right.
Um, so it kind of creates this situation, in high school specifically, where you have the individuation, you have the difficulty with boundary setting, you have the nature of the groups which are high in embeddedness, you have a lack of compartmentalization when it comes to relationships. This creates a huge hotbed for codependency, I think.
Right. And as you're talking, Sipan, like I remember too, like of course, like those like four contributing factors, but also I think a lot of the content and like the shows and movies I watched like really encouraged like this group of girls who just like did everything together. I remember, I don't know, it might have been after high school, but I remember I used to read the it's like the Secret Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. It's these four girls and this pair of jeans fits them all perfectly. It's really stupid. It's a really good story. And there's like romance and drama. But I remember reading it and like wishing I had these like these girls, like something like these girls in my life. And so what are your thoughts too on like the culture, A, not preparing them or like instilling them with boundaries, and then B, like really pushing like a like answer at 3 a.m., like we're together all the time, like we rely on each other solely, like these norms like from media. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely get what you mean by that. And I mean, this kind of ties into sort of the idea of what was that thing? There's the twin flame, and then there's that other phrase I always forget, soulmates, right? So it is that's just the case, That's
Right.
just kind of what media kind of perpetuates, and because of social media now, we can all feel connected with pretty much anybody at any time, anywhere. So again, it's sort of like that group embeddedness or like hyper connectedness is has been catalyzed or accelerated by not only the technology, but also kind of that's what's being perpetuated in media. It is
Mm-hmm.
nice. I mean, you have to keep in mind, um, fundamentally, human beings want connection, mastery, and autonomy. Like those are the big three. Connection's a
Yeah.
third of it. When you're 14, you don't really have mastery over anything. Hopefully you do. You're kind of beginning to, maybe if you're in a sport, or if you're into academics, you're beginning to have mastery. Autonomy you don't really have very much of. That's kind of the beginning of the individuation. That's kind of why getting a car, like a license to drive a car, is such a big deal, because you get some sense of autonomy. Like I could,
Right.
within reasonable means, I could be anywhere. So the number one thing between those three that you could really have some sense of autonomy over is connection, is who I connect from. So
Right.
I guess that adds to the four things I just brought up, the four contributing factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, and then, being connected is not a bad thing. I'd say it's a great thing, and it's something that we're all kind of hardwired to really seek. But it seems like we as a society, we haven't done a good job of preparing our teens with the defense mechanisms and some of the things that they should kind of look out for when it comes to codependency.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So I'm hearing, I feel like we're discussing like a broad overview of contributing factors. I'm curious, like on a day to day, what have you observed codependency looks like in teen boys? Like, yeah, what might that look like at school, extracurriculars, with friends, with family, girlfriends,
Um,
boyfriends?
yeah, oftentimes it seems like it could be a few things. It could be sometimes it'll seem like it's very healthy. For some people, let's say you're 14, 15, and you'll really dedicate yourself to one sport or
Right.
one, I guess academic pursuit, which is fine. And I'd say that, at that age, especially for a teenage boy, you need to really find some purpose, to find something that you could dedicate yourself to. I went to a high school where we didn't have any sports teams. It was just like it was a STEM school. So, but we had
Wow.
like a top 1% robotics team. So I was part of the robotics team.
Mm.
And I recall getting to school around 7:30. I'd be in the parking lot by 7:30, start school around 8. This was my senior year. I don't know what time I'd get off, maybe around 2:30-ish or maybe around 2. Go home, maybe take a break and then go back to school. And I'd be in school until around, at some nights until 11 p.m. you
Wow.
know. But at that time, first of all, you have infinite energy when you're like 16, 17. And it wasn't something that was a chore, it was something that was really enjoyable. And I look back at those times really fondly. So again, we go back to like those three things. Like we need connection, especially at that time in our lives. And I've heard stories about, a lot of kids, making healthy connections with, in my case, the robotics team. And, I have clients for the soccer team, or some clients are really into drama and acting. And, they love being on stage, and they make great connections, not only with their friends, but also, mentors that they have, whether it be professors or teachers or, assistant principals. So there is a way to kind of, that desire to connect, maybe to a point where you kind of lose where you end and somebody else begins, is there, but there is a healthy way to go about it. And then, of course,
Right.
there are unhealthy ways to go about it.
Right.
There are the clients that say, I can't possibly see myself being with somebody else besides this person,
Hmm.
or we have to go to the same university. If we don't both get accepted, I don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Or, there's many cases where, you know, there'll be a teenage boy who has a solid friend group, and then he gets a girlfriend. It's his first girlfriend. And again, he has a really hard time. And then he won't notice it until it gets to the point where his friend group will maybe hold a resentment towards him for not spending time with them anymore,
Right.
for feeling like you've forgotten about us, we've been with you for so long, you've only known this person for 6 months, for example.
Yeah.
Which is, it's common, it just kind of comes with the time.
Right.
When you're 16, it's a really important time to kind of explore your identity, what you want to do, who you want to be, and who you want to do it with.
Hmm.
um, and I believe this is I'm paraphrasing a quote from Naval Ravikant. He said the three most important questions you could ask are what you do, where you do it, and who you do it with, right? And those teenage years are the beginning of asking those questions. And it is, if you want to look at it from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, it is a lot of all or nothing, cognitive distortion thinking patterns.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, one reputation, I don't know if it's like universal, but within the therapeutic field, um, working with teenage boys is difficult.
Hmm.
So, how do you approach working with these clients, especially if they're resistant to the therapeutic process?
Yeah. It's a great question. And, the funny thing is, when I first started at Pepperdine, I said, I'll work with any population besides kids. I just want to work with 18 and up. I want to work with adults. And of course, it's the funny way the world works is, now that's not only my specialty, but that's what I really enjoy.
Mm.
Um, and it's a good thing because I feel like there's a supply and demand issue there. There's not very many therapists that enjoy working with teenage boys specifically. Yeah, yeah. And it's common, it's understandable. They're not an easy group to get along with. Um, but I ended up at Child and Teen Counseling, and I'm really lucky just because I feel like they're one of the best, if not the best, practicum spots that I could have possibly gotten placed in. And I was like, all right, I guess I'll just work with kids. I mean, how bad can it possibly be? And it turned out I really enjoy it. But
Mm-hmm.
to what I would say is when it comes to resistant teens, there's a few things that I look forward to. A few things that I look for, especially in the beginning, especially before you have a solid level of rapport built. Um, so I'd say there's one of the key things is that anytime, let's say you have a 16-year-old boy, you get him in the office. In my case, what I do is I'll have the parents come in. We'll kind of talk as a group. We'll talk about, some of the goals, and then I'll have the parents go out to the lobby, and it'll just be, the client and I. And at that point, it's really I have to get him to understand it's probably in the first month, especially in the first month, I think it's really important that in the eyes of the client, the therapist and the parental unit are not combined. You want to
Mm-hmm.
differentiate yourself as a therapist from the parental unit in their mind, right?
Right,
So you want to make sure that you don't seem like an extension of their parents.
right.
So at that point, I say, look, your parents have these goals, but it's important that you understand that, in here, this is your space. The ball is in your court. And if you don't want to work on those goals, that's fine. We don't have to work on those goals. It is my job as a therapist to kind of try to, get you to see the value in working on the goals that your parents want you to work on, right? And I'll try to maybe inject some of the goals that they find that the parents want you to work on into our sessions. But it's up to you. And some of the way I could get buy-in is like, look, even if you don't want to work on this, maybe if we could show some improvement in this domain specifically, we could get your parents to kind of hop off your back and ease up a little bit. And at
Right.
the very least, that is, that's kind of something that they resonate with. So you want to definitely individuate yourself from the parental unit as a therapist. You want to make sure that
Mm-hmm.
the client feels like they have a high level of autonomy in the therapeutic context.
Right.
So when you're here, this is your time, this is your space. If anything, it's like I'm like your assistant pretty much,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I kind of create that dynamic between me and the client. Um, and then I go over and talk about some of the boundaries. This is super important, especially when it comes to phone calls. I always mention this is look, as a therapist, what you say in here is confidential. There are a few exceptions. So I'll tell them
Right.
about the exceptions, the obvious ones, and I'll say, if I ever feel like your life is in danger, that's something that I have to tell mom and dad about. That being said, if you tell me that you're using substances and like a reason, if you're drinking alcohol or smoking weed, which is it tends to be the case with 16-year-old boys, that's fine. Now, if you tell me you're drinking and driving, that's a problem, right?
Right.
So we want to make sure that you're within some bounds. And then I always tell them that occasionally I'm going to call mom and I'm just going to do a little check-in call, I call it. um, if you walk past the kitchen and you hear that mom's on the phone with your therapist, don't freak out. I'm not giving away your secrets. It's a very one directional phone call. So, and I'll tell mom this when I get on the call with mom. I'll remind her about confidentiality, and I'll go over and tell her that it's going to be mostly her talking and telling me about what's going on at home, just so I could get another perspective. Right? I
Mm-hmm.
just want to get a more holistic perspective on my client. So I'll ask about any major things, any changes happening in the household, what's been working, what hasn't been working. Have you seen any improvements in some of the goals? What other goals would you like to inject? So it's a very one dimensional. I'm just taking notes and I'm just listening.
Right.
I'm not
Feedback.
giving away exactly the content
Yeah.
of the sessions. It sounds obvious to us because we're therapists, but this is huge for a 15-year-old boy that walks in and is resistant. Another thing that I found is as therapists we get taught like there's open-ended questions and there's closed-ended questions. If you have a client that comes in and they're very resistant, oftentimes you'll get these like, so what, why are you here today? I don't know. Do you want to be in therapy? No. You get these sort of monosyllabic grunts, they become cavemen, like, oh, huh. Do not do open-ended questions. Do
Mm.
closed-ended questions. You want it to even on a more extreme point, if I have a client that's very resistant, all it'll be like the first 3 or 4 sessions might be essentially like worksheets essentially. Like you have to answer these questions. They're closed-ended questions. I try to keep everything as short as possible. Um, of course, well, I actually have a process when it comes to my intake is something that I consider about 5 sessions. The first five
Mm-hmm.
sessions I consider to be the intake. So what I do is a self object and I do a timeline, right? So the first initial session, that's when the parents come in, and then I'll have, the parents step out and it'll just be me and the client, and then I'll have the client step out and it'll be me and the parents, and I'll just kind of run over everything.
Mm.
The second session is really the first session that I have with the client one-on-one for the entire duration. And
Right.
that's when I start off with the self object. So I do not work on goals. I do not talk about goals that the parents want me to enact in session. I try to increase the amount of structure in session when there's a lot of. So the amount of resistance is directly correlated to how much structure I try to enact in the session, if
Right.
that makes any sense. So if
Totally.
somebody's really on board, open-ended questions, why are you here? What are we kind of trying to talk about? But of course, that tends to not be the case. So I start off with a self object. So I'll get a piece of paper and I'll say, look, this is something that I do with all my clients. It looks different for everybody. So you're gonna, especially for my younger clients, so let's say 8, 9, 10, and 11, I'll say, you're sort of gonna give me a tour of a house, and every bedroom is like another person, right? So these are like important people. So family
Mm.
members, teachers, friends. With my older clients, it tends to look kind of like a genogram. Of course, the rules aren't as strict because genograms get very complicated. So what it'll look like is kind of like a lighter version of a genogram, where I'll say, okay, here's your immediate family. We'll draw it out with the circles and the squares and the lines and everything. And then after that, we'll do maybe friends, extended family. And then I'll say, other institutions that you're a part of that might be important. It might
Right.
be, Boy Scouts, water polo, church, whatever. We'll add those too. And then at that point, we'll kind of look it over. I'll ask them a few questions and I'll say, okay, now we're going to do pluses and minuses. So next to every single relationship, do either a plus, a minus, or both.
Mm.
Oftentimes, both seems to be the most common just because, relationships are good and bad. There's no all good, all bad relationships.
Yeah.
So I'll have the client go through and do the pluses and minuses. And I've learned so much. This will be keep in mind, this is the second session, the first individual session with the client. And I might learn something that may have taken 3 months, right?
Right.
I had a client in one case where next to his maternal grandfather, he put 5 pluses. And I never mentioned anything about, the number of pluses. It was kind of implied that it's either one
Like
plus,
a
one minus, or a
rating.
plus and a
Yeah.
minus. But
Wow.
he put 5 pluses next to his maternal grandfather. And I said, wow, this is probably a really important relationship for you. And yeah, this was like the number one relationship for him. Of course,
Wow.
his parents had pluses and minuses, but this was for him like his grandpa was like his everything. His grandpa,
Mm.
this kid was really into soccer. He's huge into soccer, wants to become a professional soccer player. And his grandfather used to be a professional soccer player, used to be a goalie. And his grandpa makes sure to make it out to all of his soccer games. And that's really how they connect together.
Mm.
So that really allowed me to get, a good level of insight into what relationships are really important. And then additionally, it's super useful when it comes to, you almost have to trick the client into doing therapy without them thinking they're doing therapy. So it's really useful when it comes to goal setting. So for example, let's say there's like next to mom, there's only a minus. I'll say,
Mm.
okay, in a very non-judgmental way, I'll say, I'll do like a curly bracket next to the minus. And then I'll say, can you kind of put bullet points and tell me what goes into that minus? So we'll expand upon that minus.
Right.
Oh, it's this, 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 this. And then those are opportunities for goal setting, right? Then we lead into what can we do to kind of make this a little bit better, or to make this minus a little bit
Mm-hmm.
smaller, maybe turn into a plus and a minus.
Right.
So the self object is really important. I start out with a self object. So again, think about all the structure that's being enacted in session. The client essentially has no time for open ended questions. It's like, do this, do this, do this.
Right. You're not
What's really
staring at each
valuable?
other like,
Exactly,
yeah, traditional
exactly.
therapy with resistant teenage boys. It just doesn't work. Yeah.
And I should also mention that we get there. It just takes a while to get there.
Right.
But those resistant clients, they'll come in and it's like, maybe a month in or 2 months in or 3 months in, it's like they're like a regular client and they can be very mature for their age. And it's
Yeah.
almost like, I treat them like an adult client, but it takes a while to build up. And, it takes a while to build up because you need to build that rapport and that trust, and you need to show them that, you care. So after the self object's done, after we have some goals in the self object, we go off to a timeline. And a
Mm.
timeline is very valuable, just because personally, this is something that I did in my class at Pepperdine, where my favorite professor, Dr. Winston, he taught us about the self object and the timeline, and our homework assignment was to do it for ourselves.
Right.
And the self object was really big for me, especially because you have to keep in mind that the self object can include people from the past,
Mm.
whether they've passed away or if they're just not in your life anymore. If they're
Right.
still on your mind, there's this quote
Right.
by Dr. Peterson. He says that you may be done with the past, but the past isn't necessarily done with you,
Yeah.
right? So if you could include people from the past, and that'll also help you process some old relationships. But yeah, the timeline was really valuable for me just because I got two pieces of paper, taped them together, put a long line in the middle, and this was Dr. Winston's instructions. Basically, put a little dash every couple, every inch or every couple centimeters for every year you've been alive. And then on one side, do all the big positive stuff, and on the other side, do the big negative stuff. And what
Mm.
he would tell his clients is, look, if something traumatic happened, you don't have to tell me what happened if you don't want to share with me. But all I ask is that you put a T and you circle it around when it happened, just so I could get an understanding of, around what time, something happened, just so I have a time frame.
Right.
And it was super useful. I remember it was kind of an emotional process for me personally doing it, just because going through 25 little tally marks. It's like, wow, I've been alive for, it doesn't seem like I've been alive for a long time, but I've been alive for a really long time. 25 little
Mhm.
tally marks. And then going through and doing the positives and the negatives, and you really see certain influences come to the surface. And even as a therapist at the time, and somebody studying clinical psychology at the time, you may have missed something. And I really like those two, the self object and the timeline, have been super useful. I do it with almost every single client.
Yeah.
Um, and Dr. Winston, he actually taught my developmental psychology course. So it
Mm.
was really useful just because at that time I was already working with kids and teens. So in that way, it was really useful. It's funny just because Sigmund Freud taught Anna Freud, who taught another psychologist, who taught Dr. Winston, who taught me. So there's like a
Wow.
direct line going from me to Sigmund Freud. It's kind of a funny situation. So
Yeah.
to kind of summarize, like I went over a lot, is make sure they know about the boundaries when it comes to confidentiality. Make sure that they understand that, these goals aren't something that we have to work on. They have a high sense of autonomy in the room. The ball is in your court. Don't even talk about the goals maybe for the first few sessions. Just work on, especially if they're resistant, on enacting structure. The way I personally do it is through the self object and the timeline. This allows for us to actually work on our own goals, right? So some of the goals might be ones that, the client wants to work on. Some of the goals might be ones they're willing to kind of work on to kind of help appease their parents. And then that's where we kind of take it from. A
Yeah.
lot of my work also centers around building connection between parents and their kids,
Yeah.
but that's something we could talk about a little bit later. I think
Well,
that's kind
yeah.
of a good stopping point for me.
Well, yeah, you mentioned like the minus with the mom, which I think is very common in teens. So, yeah, I'm curious how you navigate codependency between teen boys and their parents. And it could be, yeah, I wonder if we could break it down or if you sense there's a distinction between parents being codependent with the child and or like the child really being codependent with the parents. So doing both.
Yeah. I haven't seen many examples of the child being like codependent on the parent. Because again, at that time, that is really a time in their lives where they begin to individuate from the parental unit. So that is not as common. I'm not saying it's not possible. I just haven't
Right.
seen it in my clinical practice. What I would say is that you do see situations, in my case as a therapist, where a parent will project their anxieties onto a child, where a child will be completely normal and typical from a developmental standpoint. And a parent will really be generating false positives where there are none. This is like a totally normal kid, and they'll begin to be, very worried about this, very worried about that. We need to put you in therapy. We need to kind of, figure this out. And that is when the client will be resistant for, I'd say normal reasons. Like, I get why you're resistant because your mom wants you to work on this, but to you, it doesn't seem like a big deal. And, in my own clinical opinion, it also doesn't seem like, it seems like something that's developmentally appropriate.
Right.
I've had examples of moms, looking through, a client's, a kid's text or reading through a kid's diary, which is like, A, if you get caught, there's going to be a total breach in trust. But
Yeah.
B, and this is according to, one of my supervisors actually said this, which was, and I'm really lucky to, have a traineeship at child and teen counseling because not only do I have Kent Tucson as my primary supervisor, I have Bennett Goldberg as my secondary supervisor and Elizabeth Maybalian as my tertiary supervisor. So I have three supervisors, three different perspectives, three different modalities, three different, that's a lot of experience I could call upon. And
Right.
what Elizabeth said in this situation is, look, you know, as somebody who's a licensed therapist and somebody who's a mother, I understand, you do sometimes it's like her thing was unless there's been a red flag displayed by your child, there's no reason for you to read through texts or to go through journals. So for a parent to really have no red flags and to kind of to do that maybe as like a precaution, I don't know, but that is kind of what I've seen codependence on the part of a parent look like. Is this
Yeah.
hypervigilance, these red seeing red flags where there are none, generating false positives where there are none, looking at behavior that is developmentally typical and appropriate as something that needs to be fixed or something that is atypical or something that needs to be taken care of.
Right.
And they'll project their anxieties onto their child. I've seen it a million times. I'll see it a million more. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when those kinds of clients come into therapy, it's first of all, as a therapist, you have to kind of look into, maybe there is something. Because at the end of the day, I do believe that parents are the experts on their kids. So as a therapist, we could read all the books that we want and we could have all the experience that we want, but this is somebody who's spent, this child's entire life, this parental unit's been there. So,
Right.
who am I to say that you know, they might not need therapy necessarily. So at that point, it's kind of my job as a therapist to look around and really see what's going on and to see, is this something that needs to be taken care of? And there's some people who just want to be in therapy just to kind of have a place to process things and to talk and to kind of maintain. It's sort of like maintenance therapy. That's fine too. But when you have a parent that's very demanding with goals and they really try to inject themselves into sessions,
Mm.
not only does it make my job difficult as a therapist to really individuate myself from the parental unit, it's just it's very difficult on the client. It's very difficult because you constantly have these anxieties being projected on you. So that's what I've seen codependency look like in that context.
And then, like, I want to hear how you navigate it, but what else does that look like outside of therapy? Like, yeah, what do these codependent parents like day to day? Like, yeah, how do they act?
I think they become very uncomfortable with the individual. Well, I think fundamentally they become very uncomfortable with their child individuating. It'll
Hmm.
typically start around 13 and 14. That's when these types of parents will bring their children into therapy. Um, and what I'll tell them is, look, it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. They don't like hearing that, but I think that's the case because like this is just the beginning of individuation for somebody. Think
Right.
about 16 and 17 and 18. Think about when they go off to college. You have sort of like this parental figure, oftentimes the mother, that ends up really trying to be very hyper protective of their child to a point where it becomes detrimental to their own development.
Right.
You know, they can't individuate, they can't develop, they can't.
Right.
I've seen it a million times. So that's kind of what it looks like. I feel like I was, and this kind of leads into us as therapists providing psychoeducation on what it's going to look like for the next 5 years. And this is according to my primary supervisor at my traineeship, Ken Toussaint, that always says this. It's like at this time, your child is going to kind of bounce off. So if this is the parental unit and this is the child, they're going to bounce off like a ball. And your goal as a parental unit is to be solid and stable. You want to be solid for them to be able to bounce off, but to eventually come back. And especially when
Mm.
it gets to 16, 17, they might bounce off for a while and they might really go far. But you need to trust not only your relationship, but you need to trust that eventually in the early 20s, the kids are going to come back.
Right.
He has a great, and he gives talks at schools to parents as well, parenting tips and stuff like that. He has a great analogy that he uses of, at this time, when your kid was around like middle school and elementary school, he had a hat. That hat was you. You know, that hat was the hat that was instilled by you. Your values, your traditions, your goals. You know, they wore one hat. But when they get to 13 and 14, they begin to individuate. They start to try on different hats. Doesn't mean
Mm.
they've completely thrown away your hat. They just try to
Right.
try on different hats. And you need to trust that by the time they're, 22 or 23, they're going to have a lot of hats on their head. But the biggest hat, the most influential hat, is going to be the original hat that you put atop their head. And I really, really believe in that. But that is only accomplished through having a solid parental unit, building a good sense of connection with your child, and allowing them to naturally individuate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we could also talk about kind of the connection spiel that we give to parents of because you remember I said that the first session I'll have the kids step out, I'll have the parents step out. The last few minutes I'm with the parents, and they'll say, what happened? How did it go? And I'll say, everything's good. It went fine. Um, if the child is highly resistant to therapy, I'll say, just get them in for at least 3 sessions in a row, and by that time, you know, they'll want to come to therapy. So maybe the first three you'll force them, but by the fourth one, I think the kid will, really want to come to therapy at that point. So that kind of reduces their anxiety. But I'll also ask, what are you doing to connect with your kids? And that's a really interesting question. Watching a movie together is not connection time, you know.
Mm.
I'll give some examples of connection time. It might be, for example, baking a cake or going to a park to, kick a ball around or playing a board game together as a family,
Right.
right? But you really need to be spending at least 2 hours a week connecting with your kids. And it's not so much about what you do during connection time, but it's about what you don't do during connection time. And this is, I believe this is according to a book called Connection Parenting, which again, Ken Toussaint really loves. That's really something he refers to often. It's really had an
Mm.
impact on him and on me. It's you want to avoid two types of communication styles. One is instructional and one is correctional. So instructional communication would look like, hey, go pick up your socks or go do your homework. And correctional communication would look like, for example, you didn't do a good job with this. Can you go fix it? Right now, obviously, as a parent, you have to have those two types of communication patterns. Like that's how you be. That's being a parent. But you
Yeah.
want to avoid those during connection time because that for the lack of a better term, it kills the vibe. If you're
Totally.
out on a walk or if you're playing a board game, that'll really hamper connection time. And think about it. Um, their friends at school they don't have those types of communication patterns. It's not instructional, it's not correctional. So naturally, if you're the type of parent that really relies on those communication patterns, and you have to keep in mind a super majority of communication between parents and their kids is either correctional or instructional, right? So I'd say 80% or more
Right.
for some parental units that have a hard time connecting with kids. So, and again, I'm gonna refer to I'm painting with broad brushstrokes here. So there's gonna be some gender stereotypes. So typically, the father may not do such a good job of connecting. So most of the father's communication is going to be those two styles that we're trying to avoid, right? A
Yeah.
super majority, I'd say. And the mother might be projecting a lot of her anxieties onto the kid and might not recognize their need to individuate or might not see it as something that's typical and developmentally appropriate. So that really creates a hotbed of driving the kid away.
Right.
And then we lead back into those 4 or 5 factors that we talked about initially. So you draw the kid away from the parental unit. The kid's already trying to individuate, and then here are my friends at school, and they
Mm-hmm.
become the center of attention. They become the number one factor when it comes to decision making. They become the perspective that you look at yourself through. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, I sense, Sipan, that in this scenario, yeah, lack of connection. Yeah, I feel like in some of my like more codependent relationships, like it got so toxic that like all I was providing was instructional and correctional communication.
Hmm.
Um, I wonder if, yeah, like, warning parents, yeah, especially like more codependent parents who start to like you said, this language, like be very uncomfortable with their child individuating. I really appreciate that language. But I wonder if like one outcome is the child like really pulling away, but then also for those children who potentially, for whatever reasons, like they actually like become more embedded and become more enmeshed, and like really like enable, or yeah, just really get stuck in like a like very codependent relationship with a parent. Like your thoughts on that
Hmm.
when like they don't push away, like they like, I guess, um yeah, they like attach, or I can't think of the language, but your thoughts on that, like the other extreme.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that happens. I mean, you see it in kind of somewhat related in like abusive relationships, where this person's bad, but then they become more attached to them. This person's bad for you, but you be kind of yeah. I haven't seen very much of that in my clinical experience, but that is
This might
definitely something that.
be totally gender stereotyping, but I wonder if like young girls are more susceptible to that. Like I don't know, but I just, this podcast like caters to young women, and yeah, I feel like some of my listeners, some of my patients like who did have parents or families like that, like like during these years, during this vulnerable time, yeah, I think some siblings like pushed away, and then yeah, a lot of like the listeners like ended up like stepping in and stepping up and like trying to like help the system. Um yeah, I cut you off. I'm listening.
No, 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 no. I totally get what you mean. Yeah. So it could work in two different directions, I'd say.
Yeah.
And it does seem like maybe there is somewhat of a gender stereotype, but I mean, we've seen it in girls where their friend group is their everything, kind of like
Right.
the traveling pants example that you gave.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it works both ways. It's definitely bi-directional.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, um yeah, I'm curious, like with teenage boys, if their codependency potentially like their parents on them, or their own codependency with friends, girlfriends, teachers, whatever, if that goes unaddressed during this time, what are the long-term consequences?
I mean, I guess the long-term consequences would be it sort of creates it's kind of like a weird mathematical example, but ideally you want your relationships to have some variance. You want small shocks to the system. But what ends up happening with these types of situations is you get this false sense of stability, and then there'll be some black swan event. There'll be a breakup that'll be very
Mm,
difficult. There'll be, we all know about stuff like this that happens where it's something that's so difficult for a client to deal with that the repercussions may last more than a year. So it does seem like it creates this a fragile system that
right.
seems stable on the surface. Like, oh, this is great.
Mm.
It works. We're two peas in a pod, twin flame. What was the other one? I keep forgetting the name. It was the third time.
Soulmates?
Soulmates, twin flames, peas in a pod, traveling pants, all the examples. Some of them, perpetuated by our media, but it creates the sense of stability. And then one day there's, some event that really the client will may have a difficult time kind of dealing with.
Right.
But if they had less group embeddedness, more compartmentalization, um, if they had better boundaries, if they had more kind of relationships spread out, it seems like it would make them more robust towards a break in any relationship, whether it be a friendship or a romantic relationship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess it is kind of like you do want to have a diversity and a high number of relationships, if that makes sense. That way, you become robust to those
Mm-hmm.
shocks in the system. If you only have one relationship or two relationships that are really, again, there aren't very many boundaries. Where you end and they begin is very has dissolved essentially, and there are shocks to those systems. Those systems are very fragile.
Right.
Um, the language I'm using, robust, fragile, shocks. This is all language from uh, Nassim Taleb's book Inserto. He's a PhD in mathematics, so it's
I
kind of
read
like
his
math.
Blacks. Didn't he have the
The
Black
Black Swan.
Swan? Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, that's his most popular book. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Hmm.
he's my favorite author. I love him so much. But so some of that language is beginning to seep in. But I really believe that the way you become more robust is through, I think, through numbers and having different relationships. And
Right.
some people will argue that, it's not about quantity, it's about quality, which is understandable. But at the same time, you could have many connections, right? And there was actually I believe there was a US general years ago that said they asked him about which one's better, quantity or quality. And he said, yeah, but quantity has a quality all on its own, right? Which kind of opens up a discussion about kind of emergent properties with just increasing scale. But that's a different story, I guess.
Hmm. But yeah, I mean, I think like really, if we're looking at relationships, like potentially teens, yeah, teen boys, they're vulnerable to having a certain attachment style with a parent that might involve codependency. And then if they create friendships and romantic relationships very similar to that and just maintain those patterns
Hmm.
that go unaddressed, yeah, they are really vulnerable to potential breakdowns in those relationships. And just copying and repeat. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna like, oh, I'm gonna create healthier relationships. You just find someone else who like fits that mold and the pattern never
Hmm.
gets addressed. So
Exactly. And I think that was the genius of Sigmund Freud because he recognized early on that the maps that we use to navigate relationships, you don't make a new map every single time.
mhm.
So the map that you have with your parents as an infant, it's the same map that you use to navigate the relationships with your friends as a child. And then that's the same, well, even earlier than that, the same map that you use to navigate your relationship with your siblings, then your friends, and then it's the same map that you use to navigate your romantic relationships as a teen and as an adolescent and as an adult. The map, you don't start off with a fresh map, it's the same map. And he understood this before we had, fMRI technology or a healthy understanding of neuroscience. And this is something that, Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about, where it's like these maps begin to develop even before we're verbal, right?
Right.
So and this is something that I try to, when it comes to psychoeducation, obviously, I try not to use so much jargon with my teenage clients, but I try to get them to understand that, like, if there was some sort of, well, the way I said it with one client, that again, I've known this client for more than a year. We have great rapport. 17-year-old boy. We've known each other for again more than a year, and I felt comfortable enough to say this. I kind of gave him a little bit of psychoeducation about secure attachment types, anxious attachment types. I try not to go into the specifiers of like anxious avoidant, and stuff like that. It's just secure and insecure, really. You don't have to go into the weeds. And I said, look, think about your history after I kind of told them about the different maps. I said the first map you had was with your parents. Your mom wasn't very a secure figure. Yeah, okay, yeah, I guess. Your dad left when you were younger, and that had a really big impact on you. Yeah.
Mm.
Then you had this friend group that was really flaky and kind of abandoned you at one point. Yeah. Then you had your first romantic relationship where she cheated on you. Yeah. And again, I felt like I could say this just because I had a great rapport with him. I said, bro, you're 0 and 3. Think about it. You've taken 3 losses
Mm.
so far. So that's why you have, this hypervigilance in this current relationship. That's why you
Right.
have this insecure attachment type. But it's okay because you could get to that point where you get an earned secure attachment type. Because he had a lot of questions of, why am I like this with my current girlfriend? She hasn't given me any indication or red
Mm.
flags that she's cheating or being unfaithful, but I constantly need to check up on her. I need her around. I need her in the room. When she leaves, if she's out of my sight, I feel uncomfortable. So a lot of it was getting him to build a healthy level of insight into his own underlying processes regarding his insecure attachment type. Like, this is why you're the way you are. And he found that, once he had a good level of insight, once I gave him the talk about This is what attachment types are. You're 0 and 3. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, that's just the situation that you kind of had. That's
Yeah.
the map that you're using to navigate this current relationship. That really got him to a place where, he felt a sense of not only relief, but a sense of autonomy of, I could work towards this.
Right.
And this is actually something that my current girlfriend struggles with as well. And I said, well, that's a great opportunity for both of you to work together to get out of this, for both of you to get to
Mm-hmm.
that point where you get an earned, secure attachment type. Um, so I don't even remember the question, but yeah,
Well, just
attachment types are very important.
I you're answering like the long-term consequences of it being unaddressed, but also you're giving us an example of like, if it is addressed, look what can
Hmm.
happen.
Yeah, look at all the great things that could happen. You guys can both get out of this. And some of that, has to do with, to kind of tie it back, you mentioned, the codependency of the parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, Sipan. Well, thank you so much for educating us on codependency in teenage boys. Now I'll think of them when I think of the word codependent.
Hmm.
And I will, everyone, like I'll try and put links to the connection parenting book you referenced and some of the other resources. And if people want to connect with you, hear more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, so currently I'm actually two jobs. I'm working at my traineeship at Child and Teen Counseling and my associateship at a VDN Counseling Center. So I'm waiting on my associateship number, but it'll probably be here next week, hopefully. But last week I said next week, so we'll see. You know how the BBS is. But if they want to reach out, they can reach out to me at my Avidian Counseling Center email, which is Sipan, my first name, Sipan, at counseling-centers.com, centers being plural.
Okay. I'll
So
put
they
a
could just
link to
email me.
that.
Hmm.
Okay. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And again, thank you for being here. Listeners, thank you for listening. And hope you all have a great week. And I will see you next time.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you.
Hey girl, it's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster, I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please find one.